It's not easy to be impartial with the things one likes. The original Devil May Cry is to this day my favorite game, period. The first time I played it, it definitely left an impression on me. It struck the right balance between having a genuine horror setting and being unrelenting action. But needless to say, I wanted more and, well, if you've been with the series any significant amount of time, then you know that things got complicated. The production of each game has been so drastically different that subsequently each one is a noticeably distinct product. So much so, in fact, that Dante himself has never had the same face twice. Anyway, and more to the point, right before the release of the 5th game, something had struck a chord with me. See, for all of the sequels the game has gotten, I've always felt that there was something missing from all of them, something the original had. Originally, I was very excited for the 5th game to release. Being so excited to know, I decided to revisit some old stuff from the franchise, not just the games. Amongst them, there was some side content for the animated show I decided to check out, radio dramas. And in one, there was a small scene that just made something click. In the scene, somebody makes a comment at Dante's expense. Everybody laughs at him, and he basically just sits there taking it. That's when that something clicked. See, part of the appeal of that first game was Dante himself. There was this charisma to him. He was forward-driven, had a sense of confidence. So even though he had less than 5 minutes worth of dialogue, he knew how to make an impression. This was not that character. This guy was someone utterly unimpressive. He was lazy, boring, and charmless. He looked the part, but he definitely didn't act it. I knew all this already, that's not the issue, I'm just giving context. The issue is that this little scene made me realize something that seems obvious now, but I think I just didn't pick up on it because of personal fanaticism. What I mean by that is, well, take the second game for example. First time I played it, I actually did like it, but at the time there were only the 2 games. So in retrospective, it might have actually had more to do with its association to the first game than any personal merits it might have actually had. It wasn't until after I played 3 and tried to come back to 2 that its shortcomings became evident to me. In the same fashion, with this interaction I had a similar realization. It just hit me. I haven't really liked anything from this series since the 3rd game. I've known what issues I've had with each of the products in the series, even if I didn't acknowledge them at first. But for whatever reason, this was the thing that made me realize just how long it had been since something from this series has had the same impact as the 1st or 3rd game did. In fact, if I'm being honest, had I started with any of these, I don't think that I'd be a fan. 3 is a bit of a special case. While it wasn't exactly what I was hoping to find either, it's still a fantastic game on its own. One of the best I've ever played. Not only that, but back when the game released, I was also a big fan of this Japanese movie directed by Ryuhei Kitamura called Versus, and part of the production team from that film, including the action director, worked on this game, and to me, that was a fantastic coincidence to get a mashup like this. The other games followed this same narrative style, the kind you'd find in a Japanese action B-movie, but they were never as good as 3 was. Even the action scenes were never quite as energetic. Truth be told, except for the reboot, I was pretty excited for every game that released in the series. I even defended most of them from criticism when I first played them. It wasn't until I had time to digest them that I even admitted that they had low points, or that something was missing. It took me even longer to finally realize what it was that I was looking for in them. Like I said, it's not always easy being objective about the things you like. The reason I've stuck around with this series was because I've always hoped that the next game would be able to recreate the same magic that first one had, but none of them ever did. It wasn't just an action game, it was an action game set in a horror game. It had this oppressive atmosphere and menacing tone that the later games just never bothered with. Even Dante himself, who's become a very different person, is lacking something. Actually, it was the 5th game that finally sealed the deal for me, as it were. Because, well, this gave me that little moment of realization. Playing the game, seeing what it was like, I knew that they were never going back to something like this again. When we were told that the reboot was going to be the new style for the series, I thought that that might have been it. The last nail in the coffin. Things started to look up when 5 came around, but, well, this game is arguably the culmination of all the elements that I've had issues with within the series. and seeing how successful it's been, the awards and reception it's gotten, it's clear that they'll be sticking with this formula from now on, and it's just not for me. Before I proceed, I do want to say that I don't hold any animosity towards the people who made these games, nor the games themselves. Why would I? This, as unfortunate as it might be, is just how things turned out. I can't blame anyone because there's no one to blame, and I can tell that the people who made this title made it out of love for their fans. I'll elaborate more later on, but for now, I'd like to get to the games, mostly this one. Starting with the artistic elements, well, first off, this game looks incredible. Ridiculously so. Colors are oddly dull, but it has a level of fidelity and realism any AAA title would be proud to have. Honestly though, this has never been much of an issue with these games, and artistically speaking, I do find some things to be lacking. To start with, none of these have anything resembling horror anymore, and I know that this was a very intentional choice. They did this so as not to scare away the female players, an odd choice considering Resident Evil doesn't seem to have any problems gathering female fans. I really do wish someone had told them just how involved women are in the genre. Anyway, because of the removal of these horror elements, the games have lost a certain spark. The music, the stages, the enemy designs, they're not as interesting as they've been before. This was something fundamental, a part of the identity of the first game, and personally a huge reason as to why I became a fan in the first place. Similarly, I would argue that this is the same reason only the first Jurassic Park movie is a great film. While not strictly horror, it still has some genuinely intense and frightening sequences that very much play as such, and it's because of scenes like these that the original is so memorable, while some of its sequels don't even take themselves seriously. Here, well, let's start with the creature designs, because the ones in these games are neither scary nor, at times, even demonic looking. In fairness, demonic is a far broader description with Japanese projects than with Western ones, where we pretty much stick with the Judeo-Christian concept. But for the most part, you can still tell. With these though, well okay, if you told me that this thing was a demon, yes, I'd believe you. But I'd also believe you if you told me it was an alien bug, or a transporter accident. This could be a lizard man from the jungles of South America, mad scientist who put his head on a killer robot, fairy tale creatures, mechanical creations, queen of the forest, television executive, giant larva. Oh, no. And yes, a lot of these you'd never confuse for anything else, but be it by behavior or design, these things are not threatening. What I mean by that is that even if they look the part, a lot of these things are either punching bags or they're shown to be plain dumb. But whatever the case, it's been a long time since an enemy has come off as intimidating. Some of them can be impressive looking, but that's not the standard, it's the exception. Also, the intro cues and descriptions for these things are not as good as the ones in the Bayonetta games, and I'm not just saying that because hers have full Spanish support. The stages suffer from a similar issue. This is most prominent with 4. Yeah, Fortuna seems like a lovely place to visit, but in terms of video game locations, it's not very interesting. Artistically speaking, these stages seem standard, safe, at times even featureless. For example, this is supposed to be a torture chamber, but if it didn't say so, I'd never guess it. This cemetery is not as interesting a place to explore as a cemetery should be. This forest is supposed to be something created from exposure to a gate that leads to hell itself. And yet, it looks extraordinarily plain. Imagine how much more interesting these areas would have been if this had, in fact, been a horror game. Design-wise, this isn't an issue for the reboot. No, that one has other issues of its own. Like being a bit too internet-centric, or a sentient world that I have a hard time finding intimidating. 5, though, had a similar situation to 4. While at first the world looks very impressive, before long the stages all become very monotonous, especially inside the tree. Yes, the geography is different, but the motif can be the same all over, and it becomes rather repetitive. Actually, when I first saw some of the areas in the trailers, I thought they might have taken some inspiration from Bloodborne's stage design, especially with the story's emphasis on blood, which I think would have been a great fit. Sadly, that just wasn't the case. Director Hideki Itsuno mentioned in interviews that he picked a London-like city because of his time working on the reboot, but I honestly don't think they took full advantage of it. London is this amazing city, both old and modern, full of iconic locations and architecture that would have been a great fit for a series known for its gothic settings and fantastic architecture, but the game didn't showcase as much of this as it could and should have. And what is there really gets lost behind all these roots. Not to mention, we seem to have shifted from classical art to more modern aesthetics. It's not just the backgrounds either. The music, the lighting, the sound design, none of these have a strong presence, and without that, the game has no discernible atmosphere. It lacks ambience. Take these two libraries for example. Both are generally interesting locations, and this one even has some fascinating looking books. Ultimately though, only one ends up leaving a strong impression. For one, everything that you can find in this room is out in the open. Exploration is tremendously simple. You can literally run through, collect everything, and move on to the next. Despite how impressive this place looks, there is, metaphorically speaking, nothing to see here. This room, on the other hand, is a very different experience. In terms of exploration, there are things to do and find. You can even read the books. Yeah, I know they don't say much, but they offer something. The tone of this room is also ominous, secretive. The music, the lighting, and the architecture are all very foreboding. You get a very clear sense that this place isn't safe. Here, the music doesn't even enter the equation. The tone of this room is the same with or without it. And that, I think, is the issue with the level design. Most of the areas in this game are just rooms you fight in or run through, and in the grand scheme of things, none of them stand out. Does that mean they're bad? No, they're not. That's not the issue. The issue is that they're not memorable. This, and all the other elements that are meant to help compose an atmosphere, lack presence. Except for the combat songs, I don't remember much of the music in this game. As most people who play these games know, the first game was originally a Resident Evil 4 prototype, which is evident in a lot of areas, such as the design for the sword Sparta, which, as you can see, has a similar motif with some of their designs. Its redesign, though, is not my favorite. I'm not sure how else to describe it except that, while the original looks organic, the redesign looks meaty, like a chunk of flesh with a blade attached to it. They don't look like they belong together, like they were ever a single piece. Also, it doesn't morph as much as it used to, and these tendons look like they're about to snap. Then there's Dante's new sword, which, again, I'm not crazy about. I think this one was more representative of him. I bring this up because I believe that these two swords are emblematic of the distinction between the old art style and the new one. This one originally had a very Resident Evil design, but you wouldn't know that from looking at its new interpretation, while this one here was clearly made in the Monster Hunter art style. While generally speaking, I don't think that one art style is better than the other, I do think that the original was more fitting for the supernatural themes of the game. As for the story, well, I didn't care for it. It lacked the charm and impact that the first and third game had, even with one's presentation being so anemic. And even if it was an improvement on the reboot, not being the reboot is not enough. For 5, I can tell they put a lot of effort into making something that the fans would appreciate, but I think they went overboard with it. The game is full of references to everything in the franchise, which would usually be a nice detail, but here, there's so much of it overcrowds the story. Some of these even end up becoming driving elements to the plot, not because they should be, but to make them into fan service moments, and not all work for the better. Take the scene with Ava. The events of that night have only ever been alluded to, and having only vague details about it gave it a sense of mystery and ambiguity. Having seen it now, though, has removed all of that, and turned it all into something rather... well, I hate to use the word mundane in a situation like this, but I don't know how else to describe it. The idea is that demons are coming to kill them, but you wouldn't know that from just looking at it. This could just as easily have been caused by a hitman or an arsonist or leaving the stove on. Other depictions of the event show it to be something somber, more insidious than this. The scariest thing we see here is this blatant example of child endangerment. I mean, who puts a little boy in a closet when the house is burning down? Jesus, lady. I know your kid is half demon, but he's clearly not fireproof. I feel you should know this by now. Anyway, As for the presentation, I'm assuming they were going for something melancholic, but it actually feels a bit rushed. I get the feeling that they were going down a list of things that needed to happen here, things that needed to be said, so it doesn't really come through. It felt like they missed an opportunity to do something interesting with the scene, and I think other takes did it better. Then there's the way they decided to power up the characters this time. Well, first, I honestly think that this only happened because this happened, and that this is only here because this was a thing. I don't believe for a moment that these were pre-existing concepts rather than references that got elevated into actual canon as fan service. That if this wasn't a fan favorite moment, or that if this wasn't a stage in the reboot, that this would have still happened. Even with my grievances of the references aside, these moments of suddenly gaining a new strength have become a bit too convenient and rampant. Not only that, but the implication of how Dante got his raises questions, mostly about Virgil. As I said, this is mostly a reference to the third game, when Virgil uses Dante's own sword to pin him to the ground, presumably not for his health. After, and clearly because of this, Dante's demonic side awakens. Just looking at this on its own, the implication always was that this near-death experience is what ignited his demon blood, as it were. It's been said that the rebellion is a reflection of Dante's inner self, a representation of his nature, hence its appearance. So when it transforms here, it's both a literal and metaphorical representation of his transformation. Adding to this is the fact that this is a power that Virgil already has, insinuating that he too has had a similar experience. Powerful emotions or traumatic events that unleash hidden power is a fairly common motif in Japanese media, just like in Dragon Ball. After 5 though, this is no longer the case. Now we're told that it was the sword this whole time, and that getting impaled is the key. The way Dante describes it is that his father foresaw the need, and left that sword to him for this very purpose. Taking a step back to analyze that whole scenario raises some concerns. First off, the way this works suggests that Dante's father knew that someday Dante was gonna manage to get himself impaled with his own sword. That bit alone is alarming enough, but let's give the benefit of the doubt and assume his father hoped Dante would figure it out on his own, which is far less buffoonish than the alternative. Dante also theorizes that since Virgil's sword has the power to cut through anything, maybe his has the power to bind, which apparently it does because it fuses both itself and the sword Sparta to him. This, again, all seems to be part of his father's plan. If this is all true, and looking at the results does seem to be the case, where does that leave Virgil? His sword doesn't do any of that, and even if it did, there's only one sword Sparta to fuse with. So Virgil really is getting the short end of the stick here. Hell, he barely even enters the equation. This isn't just about this inconsistency, though it does raise some questions. My issue with it is how it fits into the story, and how these convenient power-ups have become so contrived. How this has become the way fights are won. Everyone gets one and the rules are all over the place. First there was the whole emotional state angle, which apparently still applies, but only for Nero. And now, for Dante, it's getting impaled, while Virgil keeps getting the same results in a completely unrelated fashion. And then there's the whole bringing Virgil back from the dead situation. I'm not going to lie, I always hope to see Virgil again. But at the same time, I knew it would devalue the death of any character since now it's become more of a suggestion. I am reminded of a Robot Chicken sketch, where Batman loses his temper during a eulogy for Green Arrow, because he is tired of all these meaningless funerals when everyone knows, as it happens every time somebody dies, he'll be back alive and well in no time at all. A sentiment everyone applauds to, including Green Arrow. This also goes beyond just a plot. With this, we find ourselves having the same final boss fight against them for a third and fourth time within the last 4 games. With this fight in 3 being so iconic and this game's overabundance of references, this was pretty much a mandatory addition. But frankly, it feels like we've taken this from being something iconic and turned it into something standard. Another issue that I have is how the narrative dictates how the game goes and not the other way around. Take Nero. I didn't like playing as him. He felt as anemic and restrictive as he did in 4, and I dreaded playing his levels. But then, we get to New Game Plus, and with his new moves, he becomes significantly better. It's night and day. And that's just it. it's the story that dictates when these mechanics become available, not a relative sense of progression within the game that the story writes itself around. I mean, doesn't the notion that a character becomes enjoyable after you beat the game seem counterintuitive? Another example? I don't like fights where you're not supposed to win. Showing that in a cutscene would work just as well. Otherwise, why not let it happen? It yields the same results. Something that really started to bother me about these games recently is the way the characters don't seem to have normal reactions to the things happening around them. I get the idea. The implication either being that the characters are just too badass to ever let things like that bother them, they've seen it all before, or they're just putting up a brave front for the opposition. Whatever the case, it's gotten out of hand. Characters seem to have completely disproportionate priorities and reactions. Nero, for example, walks around, almost merrily, in a city littered with millions of dead bodies being a smartass. But God forbid you'd ever call him dead weight. Now that would really strike to the center of his being. Or how about these three? While one was in a coma, the other two were being held prisoners inside of demons. God only knows if they were conscious during that whole time, but again, let's give the benefit of the doubt and say no, because I don't know that the story can pull off that kind of emotional complexity. None of them know if the others are dead or what, so when they meet again and find each other, in fact, alive, you'd think they'd be able to muster a bit more than just a
Hi.
hey. Are these people really friends? I mean, he avenged your mother and freed your father, probably saving your life in the process, and he saved your soul while you, and I quote, gave him back the joy of life he'd long forgotten, and all we get is...
You okay?
Dante.
Yeah, cool, whatever. Listen, sorry to leave you naked and unconscious in the middle of the street, but it's not like I have any extra articles of clothing I can spare. In 3, Dante's very much the same way Nero is in 5. Very nonchalant and a real wise-ass. At times, even inappropriately so. However, down the line we find out that it's more complicated than that. That Dante's more conflicted about this whole scenario than he leads on, and is using his bravado as a mask. It's never implied that the bravado itself is false, but rather that he's still trying to figure things out, and that this is his default mode. So while it doesn't look like it, Dante does actually care. Here though, I don't get the same impression from any of these people. It's not as though there are no dramatic sequences either. But with those being the ones that get an actual reaction, there's this implication that the story is basically telling us, don't focus on that, only this is important. Because of this, both 4 and especially 5 seem dramatically stunted. With 4, just about everything Nero does has to come back to his girlfriend somehow. He has no other driving force. While in 5, characters seem unable to express basic emotions, almost like it was awkward for them to do so. That doesn't mean that I want them to become melodramatic either. That'd be just as ridiculous. But there is a right balance, and even if they're both cheesy as all hell, 1 and 3 did it better than 4 and 5 did with their odd dramatic priorities. I'm not saying they had better stories, especially in the case of 1. It's just that I don't find myself questioning the characters' priorities as much. It seems more earnest. Moving on to the gameplay. Well, I think it's fine, but I really didn't enjoy it as much as I hoped. But that comes from a personal disposition more than anything. You see, I've been playing 3 and 4 since each came out. That's 2005 and 8 respectively, and these characters have had the same moveset since. By the time I was done with the special edition of 4, I was already getting burned out on Nero's combat, what with his being so anemic by contrast and the game being so repetitive. It didn't help that all those characters had to share those stages, making the repetition even more prevalent. When 5 was announced, I was actually expecting that they were going to have a whole new set of combos and animations, but that didn't happen. So by the time 5 released, I've been using the same combos for Dante for 14 years and Nero's for 11. I just really hoped that I wouldn't have to keep using the same Red Queen combo A, B, and C, or Rebellion combos A and B, or that Shuffle and Air Rave would have different animations, or inputs, or anything to make a noticeable difference. I was hoping the new functions would alleviate some of the fatigue that 4 left behind, but again, no such luck. Shuffling Dante's moves around his new sword helped a bit, but ultimately, it's still the same moves again and again. While on the topic of Dante, I'm also tired of the style system. Even if this is the best implementation I've seen to date, I would have liked to have seen something new by now. I also wish these games were harder. I know that they made them easier so as not to scare away potential new players, but I think they made them too easy. Back before the 4th game came out, the director of Ninja Gaiden compared it to his games, and said that the enemies in 4 were not so much opponents as they were targets. At the time I thought he was just running his mouth, but now I see his point. Fighting some of these enemies is like hitting a pillow with a stick. It's not as satisfying as with other games. Same with 5. When compared to the enemies of 1 and 3, these enemies are floaty and a lot of them are very passive. They might be better animated, have more sophisticated attacks, patterns, and AI, but they are slower, telegraphed for days, and are far less aggressive. There's also one too many that have to be chased after, and when the challenge comes from getting to them, it's more annoying than challenging. Actually, challenge might not be the right word for it. A game doesn't have to be hard to be fun. I suppose it has to do more with aggression, with having enemies to react to. Here's the thing though. The reason enemies are less aggressive and have such long wind-up animations is to give the player time to react, to change styles and dodge, which is a 3-input function. This way new players are given big enough window to react, adapt to it, and learn. Now, I understand that, but I would still rather have more aggressive encounters and the mechanics to match. I imagine the reason enemies feel so weightless and the camera so inert is because of the game engine. It makes everyone and everything feel floaty, and I've even had to make the effort to get myself to the ground more often than I care for. I'm guessing this is to make staying in the air easier. Well, it does that. I'm wondering if the engine is also the reason the lock-on can be so unreliable. This, by the way, happens too often to not be an issue. As I alluded to before, the exploration here is very basic. If you have to go left, you'll probably find something on the right. There are only a few well-hidden spots, but none of them are in the city, and adding a few hard-to-find places would have been a great excuse to explore other, better parts, because the areas you can find, I wouldn't call fascinating. While I'm not a big fan of the reboot, there were a few mechanics I wish they kept, namely the ability to pick whether you go to or bring your enemies to you with the grapple mechanic, and the dedicated dodge function. Yeah, that kind of thing. Something that's bothered me since 4 is how you can no longer change your weapon's loadout in the pause menu. The idea is for the player to have access to their whole arsenal on the fly, which is a noble concept, but because of this they've limited the number of weapons you get in each game. In 3 you had 10, but in 4 you only get a total of 6, and 8 for the reboot. I don't understand why this is no longer an option. In 3 it was a matter of memory capacity limitations on the PS2 hardware, but what is the reason now? I will gladly take options galore over the novelty of having the whole arsenal in a single loadout if it means more toys to play with. It's not that big an inconvenience. Lastly, V is odd. I like the concept more than the execution. The fact is, his actions are not always immediate. Reactions from button input to execution vary way too much to ever be reliable, and since his summons move independently, it just creates more uncertainty. Oddly enough, they still make it work. As unreliable as the combat in V's sections is, it is no harder or easier than any other character. Even so, I just don't care for his gameplay. Now, moving on to what used to be one of my favorite aspects of these games, the characters. Because, except for Nero, all returning characters have become a downgraded version of themselves. Both Trish and Lady are little more than glorified cameos. They don't even get to have consistent voice actresses assigned to them. And honestly, they're only here in N4 because they're popular. Their appearances have become mandatory, but ultimately they serve no real purpose. There is nothing in 5 that they say or do that can't either be removed or altered slightly so as to not have them in there at all. Even their PG-13 nudity is censored. This is why I think flooding the game with references only served to crowd the story. All these things only ended up drowning each other out, so very few of them get to have enough space to be properly explored. Both of these characters had a strong impact in their respective games, but now neither carries the same strength or presence that made them popular to begin with. I've heard it said that this is because their individual journeys have already gone full circle, that their stories are complete and the developers don't know what to do with them. I mean, who is Lady without her vengeance? She can't exactly go around being the same as she was in 3, but both her and Trish have become borderline blank slates, which is even worse. And that's just in this game. In both 4 and the animated series, they come off as rather antagonistic towards Dante. They can be downright malicious. Their move to photorealism has also done some odd things to them. Trish looks tremendously off. Not just as her, but she looks unrecognizable from her model, and that hair effect is not helping in the least. Lady looks generally fine, as in she doesn't look weird, but she also doesn't look like she used to. I suppose that this is not an easy face to find in real life, but still, I don't see much of a resemblance. Nero, on the other hand, is pretty much the same as he's always been. Same general attitude and personality, though they did tone down some of his more annoying attributes. I was going to say he's not as whiny as before, but then there's this whole thing where Dante calls him dead weight, and he just won't let it go. A whole month goes by and he still won't drop it. I mean, I get it, father figure, but for a whole month? I know Mexican women who don't hold a grudge this long. Okay, not many, but I know them. Doesn't speak well of a character who likes to insult others to have such a thin skin. Seems petty. As a character, I don't dislike Nero. Quite the opposite, actually. Though truth be told, I liked him better after the reboot. As the new lead though? No, not so much. And while in 5 he seems to have graduated from being a Dante lookalike, it really wouldn't bother me either way if he was there or not. And yes, by the way, Nero very much is the new lead, and it is very evident. In all the promotional work and materials for the game, he is always front and or center, while Dante's off to the side somewhere. He's the only one who's ever by himself. The announcement trailer was to showcase Nero, while Dante had a cameo at the end. Even in the game itself, he gets first, last, and the most stages. And just looking at the opening main menu, it's obvious who the focus is going to be on. Logo even lines up to give him wings. In terms of design, he's very reminiscent of Dante from the reboot. Same short hair with a similar style, coat with a hood about as long, and a similarly shaped sword on the same side. In fact, the first time I saw that trailer I thought it was Dante. In fairness, he did get a lot of his design from Nero's first, so seems only right. I'm somewhat ambivalent towards his new look. Well, it's not bad, and I think the new hair helps to distinguish him from Dante, but the torn sweater makes him look rather raggedy, and I like the old color scheme and design concept better. Now, his devil trigger reminds me of something from Onimusha, just naked so it looks a bit silly.
Feels like I'm wearing nothing at all. Nothing at all. Nothing at all.
As for the robot hands, well, gameplay wise I can definitely see the benefit of, but thematically speaking it's not something I'd ever hope to see in these games. It's as far as it gets from the original concept. Like I said before, V is odd. He's surprisingly charismatic and has some legitimately cool moments. As his own character he's fine, but as a part of Virgil, I just don't see any resemblance. Physically or character-wise. One is very serious, the other playful. One speaks almost exclusively in poetry, while the other's only ever done it once and never before or since, and so on and so. Design-wise, he grows on you, and I do like the way they appropriated the tattoo summons from the reboot here. I can't stand this woman. Just can't. Every time she opens her mouth and says something irritating, I want to and have skipped the scene. There have been some obnoxious characters in the series, but she tops every one of them. The bird is almost as bad. He reminds me of Iago from Aladdin, but at least with him I don't feel like I'm going to strangle somebody. Virgil feels significantly toned down, even neutered, defanged at times. His introduction starts out fine, but he quickly becomes kind of a pushover. Both Dante and Nero berate him, insult him, bark at him, which is not a problem. What is the fact that he just stands there and takes it. He barely even reacts. He was always calm and collected, but he was also fierce.
What's the matter? Want to try another round? Of course.
Now, I don't see enough of that intensity here. His presence was every bit as strong as Dante's, but every trait that made him so iconic is gone. Without that strength of presence, he no longer has the same impact he had before. Even that iconic fight from 3 they're recreating comes up short, because he doesn't have the same build-up or traits that made him so memorable and formidable in the first place. V gets more of that than Virgil. And out of the whole game I can only think of one legitimately memorable moment.
It's past your bedtime. Make haste on.
It's not very often, but every now and then he also reminds me of his reboot version. They even changed his feelings towards his mother to be more in line with that interpretation. While before he wanted power because of an unfulfilled need to protect himself and her, Now it seems to be because he doubts her love for him. While I am glad Virgil finally got a new outfit, I'm not too sure about the new design. The silhouette isn't particularly interesting or dynamic, and aside from the color, the coat is basically the same as the old one. Might be the thorns. Overall, I think the outfit is fine, but I guess I just always picture Virgil wearing something more elegant. Also, am I the only one who thinks it's weird that Virgil's human half looks like this, while his demon half, along with that tree of his, look like something inspired by Junji Ito, only to end up looking like something drawn by Go Nagai? I mean, shouldn't his human half look like him and his demon half like his Devil Trigger? I get that that would have been some pretty heavy spoilers on both parts, but I'm pretty sure we all knew one or both of them was going to turn out to be Virgil from the start anyway. And finally, there's Dante himself. On a personal level, this might be the lowest point of this whole ordeal, because what used to be one of the most memorable characters I ever played as has become, well, the way he is now. The man used to have energy and bravado, the occasional gravitas. He carried himself with an air of confidence, well, arrogance in the third game, but starting with the animated series, he suddenly became lethargic, lazy, disinterested, and by extension, uninteresting. This man was as far removed from his previous versions as it got. Yeah, even that one. Stoic, not lazy. I'm not sure what description the animation studio got was, but aside from being powerful and good at killing demons, he has absolutely no admirable traits. Even his friends don't like him, and considering the lengths they have to go to just to get him to move, I don't blame them. It's like watching an interpretation from someone who doesn't like the character. Yeah, I get that there's an implication that he's faking disinterest, and all these iterations. But all day, every day, at all hours, and to everyone? 4 wasn't quite that bad. He didn't seem lazy, per se, but... well, actually, this pose right here describes his general attitude pretty well. Nonchalant as all hell. Everything seems easy to him, and he acts accordingly. Again, powerful, yeah. Good at killing demons. Has a few moments. But he is just missing something. And then we have 5. Actually, even before its release, there was a prequel novel for the game and, well, it doesn't paint him in the best light. In it, Dante's portrayed as being tactless, charmless, and dismissive, which apparently he got from his father. He doesn't remember the names of women he's met, nor demons he's had these grandiose battles against, because he's just too laid back to worry about the details. He's got all these dismissive lines as to why he doesn't bother, when really, it all comes off as excuses as to why it's okay to be a moron. In the actual game, he's not much better. At the best of times, he's uninteresting. At the worst, he's embarrassing. There's a bit of all these interpretations here, and not in the best way. The original concept for Dante was a man who could always smile, who never panicked no matter the circumstances, but could still be serious at times. I don't see that here. I understand the principle. The idea is that he's guarding himself, and I know that this is something that came from his original version, but I seriously think they've taken it too far. This man is so laid back it borders on apathy, which does apply to more than just him. Even when he's being serious, he reverts back so fast, it rarely comes off as sincere. It was also said that Sparta possessed a great intellect, which one would have hoped he passed down to his sons, but nope.
When in doubt, smack it. That's our family motto.
Everyone's a moron. If you need to beat something intelligent, you do it with a stick.
It's been a while since I used my brain this much.
This feels like a parody of the character. Ironic, considering I see more of the original character in a very cartoonish interpretation than in the realistic one that acts like a cartoon. The man has lost just about everything that made him such a memorable character in the first place, and they even turned him into a slob. Yes, his office was always a mess, but he was never so with his own persona. He was never unkempt, and that is a significant distinction. Speaking of, I'm not liking this design at all. His outfit doesn't look worn, it looks ragged. The colors are faded, there's noticeable wear and tear, and it's dirty all over. Which is great for showing off the capacities of your new graphics engine, but it makes him look like a hobo. And that's before the coma.
Get some rest.
I get that the scruff is supposed to make him look rugged, but he just looks like a mess. Even if that wasn't the case, I don't find this design particularly appealing. I don't think a duster was the way to go, and this hair really doesn't complement that face. It's not a particularly interesting silhouette. Overall, just looking at him, stylish is not the word I use to describe him. For whatever reason, they got this stereotypically handsome male model looking guy to do the body scans for Dante, only to stick him with this tattered look. Let me put it to you this way. If you told me that this guy was the devil, yeah, I could see it. Devilishly handsome definitely fits. This guy? No, not so much. By the way, this guy was in his early 30s when he did the body scans for the character. This guy looks to be well past his mid-40s. Both him and Lady are around the same age, and so are their models. So why does he look so noticeably older than she does? Also, he keeps doing this thing where he scrunches his face, makes him look froggish. Not sure what's going on with that. For the record, I have nothing against Ruben Langdon as a person or as an actor. Spoke to him once online a few years ago, and he seems like a legitimately nice person. But to me, Drew Coombs will always be the voice of Dante. There is another thing I always hope to see explored more, and it's in relation to this scene. Here, it's made evident that Dante's demonic blood isn't just there for the say-so. You know, the way he's rising like Nosferatu. There's something clearly otherworldly about him here, but nothing like this is ever shown or explored again. Now, as for his actual character, I know where they got these traits from and the reasoning behind them, but I don't find it to be sound. See, the original game had its own prequel novel, which chronicled Dante's time as a mercenary. Back then, he was going by the alias of Tony, and was famous for refusing to take job offers, no matter how much they paid. There was just no talking him into it. Sounds about the same, right? Here's the difference though. In the animated series, people have to force him because he never feels like it. He just doesn't want to, he's being lazy. Here though, the reason he refused to work was because he was only interested in the right kind of jobs. Bizarre ones like ghost hunting or devil purification. The kind that struck at his sixth sense. Supernatural ones. It was just that the money didn't matter to him. I know it's difficult for the developers to know what to do with him. The most significant aspects of his life have already been explored, and it's probably not easy to find a way to challenge him. But that in and of itself is the issue. I think that, and hear me out on this because this could very well be my thesis statement on this character, but I think that the worst thing that ever happened to Dante is that they made him too powerful. Yes, Dante has always been powerful. Even in the first game it was said that he was more so than even his father, who is the literal stuff of legends. But he never breezed through any situation. He had to struggle every step of the way, and he definitely didn't get through unscathed. In that first game, he was beaten, stabbed, electrocuted, impaled, struck by lightning, thrown into the ocean, beaten again, strangled, drowned, electrocuted again, impaled a few more times, and lit on fire. And that's just in the cutscenes. God only knows what else from the actual game counts. Even in 3, where that whole thing of showing off on your enemies started, he wasn't untouchable. Yeah, to a lesser degree, but still enough to count. It wasn't about the beatings though. It was about the struggle. That's what makes the journey interesting. Climbing the side of a tall mountain will always be a far more interesting experience than skateboarding down a gentle slope. I don't care how well you dance on the way down. That's what we've lost. Dante no longer struggles, he strolls. And why shouldn't he? Nothing challenges him anymore. He's never in any danger. And as I said before, with him being so disinterested, he himself has become uninteresting. Sure, this happens. But think about it. Do they really follow up on it? Once it's over, it's back to business as usual. Back to always winning, to never feeling any real sense of danger. And like I said, even he doesn't feel as threatening as he once did. Actually, on the subject of Dante and Virgil, there is something I wanted to bring up. I don't know why, but they've decided to make it so that they're no longer identical twins. This was one of the most prominent parts of their relationship, almost defining, and I got tossed out pretty unceremoniously. This is not just about their appearance, though I do think that this guy would have made a better Virgil. No, it was about the symbolism of it all. The poetry, if you will. In a book that released to commemorate the original trilogy, there is a column for the third game where the author talks about Carl Jung's dream archetypes, specifically the shadow. From this, he propositions the idea that Dante and Virgil are each other's shadow, one another's other self, the aspect within each that they repress or deny. Taking this a bit further, the fact that they had the same face added another layer to this postulation. It created an inescapable connection between the two. open things up not just to the relationship, but how they view themselves and each other. If they are, in fact, each other's shadow, who is it that they see when they look in the mirror? When they face off, are they really just trying to kill the other? Or is it that aspect of themselves that they reject? One the man, the other devil. The archetype of the evil twin is not a new concept. Opposites but equal. But it was surprisingly well executed here, and the way they approached it really opened up the narrative for both metaphorical and allegorical exploration. And it's a concept they've clearly explored, so it's not like I'm stretching here. Well, doesn't really matter, does it? That's gone now. Got tossed out with a casual indifference. Seems terribly wasteful to me. Yeah, I know that it's not uncommon for identical twins to differ as they age, but I don't accept it as an explanation. Digital media is not bound by real-world restrictions like those, and if they were, these games would be very different. That's not the only long-standing element they decided to alter. There are other changes I wasn't too happy with. But here's the thing. Even if it's not rare for things like this to happen, by merit of sheer volume, it feels like they were trying to clean house. Some of these things they changed could be called idiosyncrasies of the series, quirks even. And at first, I assumed that since they put so much emphasis on making every game accessible to new players, maybe they were trying to simplify things, so as to not get too many questions that require answers longer than one sentence. But this actually reminded me of something else. This might seem paranoid, but when the Ninja Theory staff was doing the interview circuit for the reboot, they had this habit of making fun of the old series, which had this undertone of, and that's why we changed it. Here though, rather than mockery, I get this impression that it was done because either somebody was condescending about it, or in fear that someone would be. Again, could just be paranoia. I have no basis for this, but that is the impression that I get. Despite all these things that I say, even if I am disappointed or disillusioned with this or that, I know that the situation is not quite so simple. Going back to Dante for a bit. To summarize, I don't think he's as memorable as he used to be, and I blame a lot of that on how powerful they've made him. Here's the thing about that. I don't think it's all the developer's fault. In fact, I think we're as much to blame. Us, the fans. Over the years, Dante has become more and more revered, and we've sort of cultivated this idea that he is untouchable, which, not gonna lie, did include me. And we've pressed this notion onto Capcom, probably not all too subtly either. The earliest example I can think of is when this footage first released. The reaction at the time was basically, why is Dante losing to this new guy? And I remember that it was strong enough that the staff released a statement explaining the context. This is just one example, but the point is, we've become overprotective of him. And even before the reboot, variations from certain established parameters didn't always go over too well. And this is something that extended to other areas, like the gameplay. The thing about the gameplay though is that I think a lot of the inflexibility with it comes from the existence of the reboot. Since the last time a significant change was made, it was from that. So now the very idea becomes a correlation, as in, like in the reboot, which, again, doesn't fly over very well. And I think that is the predicament that developers find themselves in. Even director Itsuno mentioned in an interview that he's learned to never change Dante too much, perhaps implying that even if he wanted to. Let's say, hypothetically speaking, that I was in their position, that I'd get the chance to make the game I wanted. Well, that's not how it works, is it? There is a large number of real factors that would go into that proposition. For instance, I'd also have the responsibilities and restrictions. Making the most successful game I can requires it to reach the largest audience possible, and that needs to be done within the time and budget allocated to me. Any aspirations I'd have for said hypothetical dream project could very well be thrown out for its greater good. Even if none of that was a consideration, the truth is, anything I make would really only be an interpretation. As for reaching the largest audience possible, well, that is a taller order with this series than most. Over the years, the franchise has garnered people with very different interests in the games. Some people are fans of the world, others of the reboot. For some, this might be their first game, while others only care about advanced combat, or any combination thereof. Interest varies from person to person, so trying to please everyone is a complicated undertaking, and 5 is a product of that endeavor. And that's just with the fans. Don't forget, corporate has mandates of their own too. That's why I can't blame the people who made these games. While I don't agree with many of their choices, including abandoning horror as a theme, their approach to items, design choices, or this overabundance of references, I still understand how things turned out the way they did. Speaking of, truth be told, it was actually the references to the reboot that bugged me the most.
This way, I think.
Like I said, I wasn't a fan, so seeing so much of it here was disconcerting. But I do know that director Itsuno was very proud of his work on it. It was even rumored that he considered resigning when it didn't perform, so I know why he added them. And in fairness, there is just as many to the other games, though I still think they overdid it. Anyway, even if I do say all these things, and I do mean them, I'm not going to blame anyone for my discontent, nor do I expect them to feel obligated to cater just to me. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to stick around and wait some more either. I got into this whole thing because of this, and I've stuck around this long hoping to get more of it. But when you get down to it, neither this, nor this have much correlation with it. Thematically, tonally, nor in the style of narrative. Even the visual similarities are becoming negligible. And seeing how successful 5 is, it's clear this is how things are staying. And no, Bayonetta is not quite it either. I love her games, but they're not really a compatible experience. That's not to say that nothing is. As a matter of fact, the first time I found something that was playing the remake of the first Resident Evil. It had all those traits I always thought the sequels were missing, even when I didn't know what they were. The tone, the atmosphere, motifs. Some are evident, easy to point at, while others are more abstract, less tangible. But they are there, and it was clear that these games were made by the same people. It didn't have the combat, but it didn't lead me to other games like them, which, as it turns out, wasn't as rare as I thought. As close as they get though, these are not a substitute. None of them have either the combat nor Dante himself. And no, Leon and his non-government sanctioned hair are not a replacement, any more than they'd be a replacement for Leon. What's more, the truth of the matter is that games like these just aren't made anymore. Not even by the people who made them. They belong to a different era, meaning that the possibility of this is long past. That the game simply missed that window to get a sequel that was actually like itself. And now, after 3, all of the games in the series have pretty much become a sequel to that, rather than the first game. This is not a disclaimer I should be making, but apparently everyone has to. This isn't me telling people not to like these games or why. It's not even implied. If you like them, what I said shouldn't detract you from that. It's your time and money. Do what you will with them. This is just me talking about why these games are not for me anymore. How they're not what I'd hoped they'd be. It's a bit disheartening to know that your favorite game will never get the sequel that you'd hope for. One that is better, but still retains all those aspects that made it so endearing to you in the first place. And yes, sequels are important, because you can only play your favorite game so many times before you get burned out on it. Besides, you can only play your favorite game for the first time once, right? I know it might seem silly to place so much emphasis on the more subtle aspects of something that's famous for being so cheesy. As it is, it wasn't exactly a perfect game. The writing was never Tennessee Williams, and the gameplay itself has aged a fair bit, can't deny that. So, these things I keep talking about might seem trivial or insubstantial. I mean, are they really that important? It's very much like chasing a feeling. Well, yes. Going back to an old example, it's the same reason people keep watching Jurassic Park movies. None of them have been as good as that first one. But we keep going to see them, hoping that the next one will be able to recapture that magic, since being a movie about dinosaurs in the modern age is just not enough. Well, in my case, it took a long time to realize what it was that was missing in the first place, and it took me even longer to realize that I wouldn't find it here again. That this is just not for me anymore. It's not always easy being honest with the things one likes, even with oneself.